the first relationship that you need to nurture is the one with your employees. And I think in professional services firms, those that hyper focus or overemphasize on clients over employee experience are the ones that kind of get stuck at a period of time. So I agree, relationships matter, but they first matter with those that are closest to you. And then they get to empower how that relationship is external.
You're listening to RevOps Champions, a podcast created for B2B leaders to help you align your people, streamline your processes, trust your data, and leverage technology in order to grow your business. We're your hosts, Brendan Deneville, CEO and co-founder of Dynamico,
and Amy Weaver, Dynamico's marketing director. You're our first Amy on the show. So if Amy, you could tell us about starting your company all those years ago and those ebbs and flows that you went through during the financial crisis and how you ended up moving on and starting something new, I think that'll be really interesting for our listeners.
Yes. And so we have like 4 hours, right? No, I'm just kidding. I can do it a lot quicker.
Hopefully it won't take that long. I'll give you 10 minutes.
That I can do. I've done this many times and different things. So John Folkestone and I started Salo in 2002. And the real premise was the relationship over the transaction. And at that period of time, we had both experienced organizations where we believed a lot in the culture and how they treated employees and what they were doing. We both had that experience. And then we also experienced times where we loved the work, but didn't necessarily love the organization that we were involved with. And
that was a Big Four accounting firm, you're saying?
There was a Big Four accounting firm. We were both at Big Four accounting firms. We didn't know each other then, which we loved the culture behind that, what they were doing and how they delivered to clients was a very real way. Then we were both in more of a temporary staffing firm where the work was good. It was fast twitch, but they didn't necessarily think of their temporary employees as employees. They thought of them as temporaries. And we said, what if we could create a home for people that wanted to do project-based work? Create that home, create an environment. You'd get more consistent quality. You wouldn't have to replace it. You could really grow and you could grow the people while growing the business. And so again, not overemphasizing clients are always right, but what if we started with the employee? And what if it was the gig economy before the gig economy was cool and kind of creating a home for people to be able to do that. And we said the relationship over the transaction. So we are going to care about the long term of what we're doing in each interaction that we have, not necessarily how we make money from it. And that was the premise. And then we're going to have fun doing it and we're going to put a little energy behind it. And that's where we're going. And I feel like we've permanently changed the world of, we'll get into that later. Anyway, so in 2002, we started. And it was coming out of, remember, 2001. And then, so it was really kind of a dearth in that. We came out in 2002. People had not been treated well. There were a lot of layoffs. And we just said, hey, we're going to help you. Like there were a lot of people. I remember the week we started Salo and we were placing finance people. There was an article in the Star Tribune in the business section that said there's 250 unemployed CFOs. It's going to take 2.5 years to get everybody fully employed. And that was the week we started. And we're like, okay, well, let's get to know them all. And that's how we started it. And it was like, we didn't know how we were going to help somebody, but the idea was if we can help you get to a future state, you're going to remember us and maybe we'll be able to be involved with that. Maybe we won't and we'll see. And that's kind of where it was. So grew like gangbusters. Like I said, 47 million in 7 years. I'll throw in a little personal history of my first son was born 9 months after I started Salo. And then I had twins 2 years later. So in the first 3 years, 0 to 20 million in revenue, 3 kids under 3 and just drinking from a fire hose. Yeah, it was a lot. The financial recession hit and we were not prepared. We just weren't. We just started putting in some infrastructure.
What was the size of your team at that point?
I think we had about 250 people at the time.
Here in Minneapolis.
All in Minneapolis at the time. And that was purposeful because it was, I didn't want to travel. I had these young kids. John still had young kids too. And so it just kind of hit us flat footed. John and I both grew up with very simple backgrounds. And so getting used to success, getting used to money, getting used to being the leader versus like part of a team and what that has, we learned a lot through that. So our decline was pretty steep. We went back pretty significantly, not quite 50%, but close in about a period of 10 months. And, we were in an organization that we never had a day of flat. Every day from the day we started was better than the day before. Like we were growing day after day, week after week. It was like a rocket ship. And you go from this to down, you go from up to down with never a day of flat. It's a good learning opportunity. That's what I'll say. Yeah. And I would say we did a lot of things wrong, but I would say the three things we did right at that time was just sort of readjust. And we just kept saying like, if we just got back to here, if we just got back to here. One day we stopped saying that and we said, what if we are going somewhere versus getting back? And that really kind of propelled us. We put in our first advisory board. So gaining that outside experience, having other people who had been through it, wish we would have done it years and years before. We might not have felt the pain so much. Secondly, John and I got a coach, both to work on each as individuals, how we were going to be as leaders, what is leadership mean, and then also how we were going to be as partners. And that was instrumental. And then the third is we put together our first ever official strategic plan. And I think if we go through, as we go through this, you're going to hear me say mission, vision, values, focus, intentionality. What are you going to do? And that was born when our company was dying.
Okay.
And so I would say that rocket ship growth, rocket ship decline, and then from there, sustainable, intentional growth came out of it. Not as fast as it was before, but everything just felt more solid. I'd like, that's kind of when we became a real company.
Comforting too.
Yeah, we were working on ourselves as leaders, recognizing that leadership matters. Like before I'd say, hey, we're all just part of this. And now it was like, okay, how are we acting? What are we doing? We started to really put in teams of people. And that growth was, again, every year up until we hit the global pandemic. We had an initial decline and then it was rocket ship again, because now all of a sudden the gig economy was fun. And the other thing that we did intentionally through that time is John and I were working on how do we make the founders, I'm going to say irrelevant in the company, but actually sort of, how are we going to get the organization to be professionally led where the founders don't have to be in it? With the idea of that gave us a lot of options. It turned out that gave us options to be able to sell and to exit to a strategic buyer. But that wasn't necessarily the plan, but we had transitioned and we had moved. We had somebody in the organization that we put in multiple different spots. She started taking on more and more responsibility, and we eventually promoted her to CEO. John and I were on the board. She was reporting to the board. And that really allowed us a really great platform that then buyers thought was good to be able to sell. So we had a successful sale coming out of the pandemic. We ended just shy of 1,000 employees.
Wow.
In 2022, we sold officially February 1 of 23.
Wow.
That's my birthday.
Happy birthday. It's kind of a birthday like for me too. New birth.
Yeah, what a big day.
Yeah, amazing story.
I love that. And so now, are you going to do some things differently this time around?
Oh, yes. I'm going to, heck yes. That's why it's kind of fun. It's just been a joy. I feel like I found just I was in the right place at the right time. And what I really feel like now is, how am I helping sort of this next generation become the best version of leaders for themselves? How can we take an organization and really, we will still go through bumps. We'll go through things that we haven't before. It's not the same organization. But how do we take some of that and truncate some of the learning things to be able to see growth and scale? So I don't know, check back in with me in a couple of years. We'll see if it actually worked or not, but it's feeling pretty good.
Yeah, that's good. Perfect.
Awesome.
That's exactly what this podcast is about, is how can we truncate the learnings for all the people listening so they don't have to go through the same painful challenges and struggles that everyone goes through. But if there's any way that, if there's a way to pass it on and truncate that process, that's always, I think, a very big gift to give.
Absolutely.
I would say get advisors that have been through it, number one. And secondly, seek feedback and learning, and recognize that if you are getting feedback, it is a gift. And thinking in every interaction, how do I get better? How do I get better? How do I iterate? What do I do from here? When I've been in that mindset, I feel like, and when the teams are in that mindset, that just feels really good.
Awesome.
You have to establish trust first. That's not an easy thing to do, but I think when that happens, it's really, really good. And that's kind of the culture I'm hoping that we're doing in this new organization. And yeah, we're already seeing some good stuff.
I would like to know maybe where your passion lies in the areas that we talk to our guests about most frequently, whether that is people, the process, the data, or technology, that all have to kind of be in alignment and integrated with one another to help grow a business.
Yes. Well, that is easy. Mine is always about the people. No question.
Okay.
Even my history has always been in professional services and has always been sort of people and service as the product, not necessarily a product as the product. And so where all of those things matter, I always say 3: people, process, systems, but I think you're adding technology,
data and technology as you could combine.
You can either overlay it or integrate it, but those, regardless, you still need people. You still need people in the thing. So,
okay.
I would say people, culture is definitely, and if I think about sort of a passion, it's truly when I'm at my best or when I feel the best about what I'm doing, it's helping people get to a place where they want to go or where they might not have seen they want to go,
Okay.
Like a destination, or like, oh, that little thing helped me get beyond where I am today. So
would that be from like a client's perspective or employees, or a little bit of both?
Yes. Or somebody I encounter, or anything like in any regard. It's like really like how to get to an outcome that somebody wants for themselves is good, or just helping them see something just a little bit differently than they see. Does that make sense?
Okay. Well, a lot of companies, obviously, their main objective is growth. And we talked to several companies where maybe their growth is really fast. Maybe some other companies or experiences that a person has had where the growth was kind of slower going and maybe a little bit more painful.
Yes.
So looking back on your career, if you could think of maybe an example of each, a team that was kind of a well-oiled machine and was growing at a rapid pace comfortably, and then maybe one that didn't go quite as well.
Or the same team in different economic cycles.
Times. Yes.
Yes. I can think of both of those very much so.
Let's hear it.
Do you want me to talk about it? Okay. So if I think about sort of different teams, when I think about what it takes to create rocket growth, I think first I'll just start when things are humming along, when growth has happened. So when I started my company, my business partner and I started off, there were 2 of us. And within 7 years, we went from 0 to 47 million in revenue. So I would call that rocket growth.
I would agree.
And it was pretty fantastic. The next section is when it goes down from the financial recession and some things that we were doing before we came out of that. And then it was more sort of sustainable, sustained growth from there. So I feel like I've been in multiple different segments of growth, but that rocket growth, I guess anytime that I feel like it's going well, it always comes back to alignment, intention, and focus. And I think if I talk about starting with alignment, having a very, very strong vision. So where are we going? You know where we're going. I know where we're going. Everybody can articulate it. Knowing the why behind it. Why are we doing this? Why do I get up and come to work? And I think the why is mostly important when things are not going well. Like you have to remind yourself, like, this is why I'm here, from like, here's why I'm doing the hard stuff.
Yes.
To like when it's going easy, like, this is why I do the hard stuff, but it's like,
yes,
what in that, what brought me to this work and what is in it for when it goes awry? And then the values, like, what are our behaviors? How are we doing? And how do I know when I'm doing it right? How do I know when I'm doing it wrong? And when do I have the most autonomy as a leader and as an employee? When you're doing it right is when you can say, these are the values. Here's what's expected of my behavior. And here's how I know how to do it. And so when I think of the well-oiled machine, it's those are in place. Everybody knows about it. Others, you might not say it in the exact words, but the essence and feel is there. And then you're on the track to be able to achieve success.
Okay. So how were you guys able to establish those and then spread that, share that, modify that as you're experiencing this rocket growth?
Yes. Well, I would say in the first segment for us, it existed and you could feel it. Like I would say we were heavy vision and heavy mission. We were like, this is where we're going and we're new and this is exciting. And those that wanted to be part of that excitement jumped on board. And I would say we didn't do as great a job at the beginning of these are the behaviors we expect of ourselves and here are the behaviors and values that exist. We weren't really as good at articulating them. And so, we hit that growth and it's because everybody that was on board was like, yes, we are going to come out of the gates and we're going to do this for this purpose. And then when we hit the bump, we hit the financial recession, we were trying to find ways, all of a sudden things started to, the onion got peeled back and you started to realize like, maybe we don't know how to say when a behavior is happening that we're doing it right or doing it wrong. How do we codify that for each other? And so when we hit the skids and really dropped, not as fast as we rose, but felt worse, and we hadn't experienced anything else, we just sort of took a step back and said, and we put in our first official strategic plan and we started from the beginning. And that was, okay, how do we put these things that exist? Every company has a culture. I think those companies that can articulate their own culture in a very specific way do better.
Okay.
So, for example, if your culture is we work hard, okay, everyone can say they work hard, but you're going to work here. You are going to make lots of money and you are going to sacrifice your personal freedoms to make lots of money. And this is what it is. And people say that and companies say that, they will attract those that want that. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But if you say, we're a light and friendly company, we believe in, flexibility and this, and then you don't perform that way, you're attracting people who aren't aligned. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
So that's a good binary example.
Yes.
And so it doesn't matter what your culture is. Like people are like, I want to work on my culture. I'm like, first, can you define it? And so I feel those companies that do well, or when I've been on a team that has performed well, we know what our culture is. We know what it's not. And then we live into that.
Okay. And hire around it, I'm assuming.
And hire around it. It's like, be true to it. This is part of our culture. We are an early morning crowd. Everybody's here by 7:30 in the morning. If you are a late night person, you will have missed a big part of the day. It's not to say that that's okay. It just might not be okay for here, for example.
Okay. Yeah. And what about, to switch gears a tiny bit, what about when you guys are thinking of implementing a new technology? How did you go about that process? And what were some things you did to ensure that everyone was on board with adopting it and the process was as smooth as possible?
I don't know. You go through lots of mistakes before you kind of get it right, I think, a lot of times.
Too.
I think when it goes well, it's just communication, making sure more people. I think there's two ways to communicate. One, it's like we communicate at the top, we figure out a message and we cascade it down. And so then it goes to this person then has to get it to 7 people, that person has to get it down. That is definitely one way. I always find the more people that are involved in making the communication at the beginning, probably can't have all 1,000 people do it or 200 people, but the more people involved with, hey, why are we doing this? What does it matter? What is it going to get to? Where are we going to get to? The more people involved with that are the more people that own it. And so let's say you have a bigger group at the beginning who does that. Then as it cascades out, more of like a cascade out versus a cascade down.
Okay.
That I have found that to be better.
Really good. Amy, I have a question for you. I know you started talking about alignment and then you were sort of getting towards intention. Was there anything else that you wanted to talk about around intentionality?
Yes, I for sure will. Intentionality matters. I always think be intentional. How you set up your office. What does that mean? How do you communicate? How do you show up? Every time I'm in a team that's working really, really well, we have said, this is how we intend to behave. And then we fill it in and behave that way. And again, I take judgment out of that, right? Just be who you are as an organization. That's okay. Set that intention. So the intentionality behind what you're doing. We had our values. One of them was positivity. So when people encountered our company, there was something going on in their lives. Either an individual was in transition, unsure of their work life, not sure what they wanted to do next, or a company was struggling getting to an outcome that they wanted, wasn't sure if they had the right team. And so you think they're always coming with some version of like, oh, I'm sort of stuck, so I have to talk to you, and just where we want them. And then for us, it's like, well, if we meet them there, that's rough. And so our intentionality was, how do we show up in a way that's positive to sort of make their day? I always say surprise and delight when someone calls in. And I remember during the financial recession, it was hard for a lot of people, including us. And one day I got a call from a client, and I got to tell you, I was like, yes, you mean we might get some business today? Like, it's a rough day. And I remember him saying, I'm just having a rough day, but I know if I call into you guys, I'm going to hear something good. And
how great is that?
It was great. Now, we didn't get business that day. So it was like, but overall, you knew we did eventually get something when they needed it, and you knew. So I would say alignment for sure, but that intentionality around communication, around change, kind of acknowledging. So if kind of going back to what you asked about sort of technology and when it goes well, I would say just acknowledging what you're going through. The more that I feel like your employees or your teams feel like you're understanding what they're going through versus glossing over it. Like, this is going to be good. This is going to be great. Just think when we can do this even faster. It feels like there's a disconnect when you're like, hey, this is going to be rough. We are going to live through some rough patches. We hope this is what we hope it'll be at the end. We don't know. but together we're going to get through it, and how we do it. It just sort of puts us all on a, hey, they get me.
Yeah.
And that's what I try to think about. They get me.
The mentality is positive, but you're also authentic and realistic, and you're noticing when it's not so great. We can have a positive outlook while still acknowledging the current reality, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah. And I think like a couple times when I've gotten it wrong, it's because I've overemphasized positivity, right? I mean, I've had multiple examples of where it's gone wrong, but one of which is it's like, yay, we're going to do this, or it's not that bad. And then, I remember, I'll take it back to the financial recession again. I remember one of my employees going like, hey, I don't know if you know, but it's really bad for our clients. So if you don't think it's bad here, maybe you don't know what's going on. And so again, any of your strengths can become your weakness if they're overemphasized. And so knowing what those strengths are and being aware when they start to be overused is really important.
Okay.
So Amy, so you started off as two people. You thrived up until the financial crisis in 08, 09, right? And then you've at some point catapulted again beyond that. So you went through a lot of change and obviously a lot of challenges that you've already started chatting about. If you kind of think back to a consistent thing, and of course we all know as business leaders, we're learning and getting better every time something does go wrong or something has to be fixed or we can make an improvement. But, one of the things I think we often don't realize is how we've become better at managing change. And you mentioned change, as part of this intentionality bucket. What are some of the things that you learned over those years? Really, it's a couple of decades, right? Of, how did you become better at change at Salo than you would have been in the beginning?
It's a really great question. I think in the beginning, everything was change all the time. So we were in such a fast growth mode. You could never put anything as this is how it used to be, because it was never how it used to be.
Change was the constant.
Change was the constant. And I think as we got bigger, change happened differently. Change was, instead of everybody being part of it, it was sometimes happening to people. And so I would say the best thing that we did was remind people that change was constant and also why it had to exist. And so again, in a professional services firm, if you are not growing, you are declining. And so like status quo doesn't give people more opportunities. And so we were hiring firecrackers. We are hiring people that were achievers, people that wanted more for themselves, were in continuous improvement of themselves and in continuous improvement for the organization. And so I think just sort of tying that change together with this change allows us to grow, to be able to create more opportunities for you to be able to grow and change. Like if we stay static, we know we will lose you because you're a superstar. And I think that tied together when we got better at doing it. I remember it was every year. I was like, we'd pull out our notes. We'd get back once a year. We brought all of our employees off or, did some version of something. It's like, we go back to notes from last year. What were we talking about? It's like, oh, we were talking about change. We were talking about growth. We were talking about this. Like, what were we saying about it? And like sometimes when we got really good, it's like, remember last year we were talking about this. And then sometimes I bring it back to remember why you joined us. You joined us because we were a fast growing, super fun, very innovative, high achieving organization. To be super fun, very positive, high achieving organization, you have to continually feed that. You are now part of that. And so at certain times, it's going to feel hard. And again, acknowledging that it's going to feel hard for them, or when it's change you want versus change you don't, it's very, very different. And just acknowledging not all change is going to be the stuff you want, but what can we get out of it at the end?
What are some examples of things that you or an employee or a client got out of it at the end? You went through the rough patch and you saw like, oh, it was all worth it. This is what it was for.
Specific examples, I would say if I just take a person who's maybe a producer, right? They are in a sales role doing it and they want to continue to grow their experience. And by doing that, they want to be able to manage and lead other people. So if you're not growing, you're not going to be adding more people for them to be able to take on more management and then more leadership opportunities. And I think drawing that up, you get a high performing team. Let's just say whatever size it is, you get a high performing team. That team loves each other, right? There is a kinship. There is like, this is working. This is fun. You throw anyone new, even if it's a great person into that, those dynamics shift. And so there are times where people go, oh, it's not how it used to be. And so I think just always a reminder of what did that person add? There's positives and negatives that come out of that. So I think that's an example. I definitely have examples with technology. You know, we put in a big, full HR system, and it was a huge disruption. You know, it was a disruption. Like before, this person held my hand through this. Now I have to do it through technology. Oh, I want that person to do it. But then calling out, so in this particular example, now the person that used to hold my hand through me getting that data now can help our employees or our consultants achieve what they want to achieve. And so being able to see if this technology works for me, we were able to deploy resources in a different way that actually allowed better client satisfaction or better employee satisfaction.
Gold. I said gold because it really is. So, Amy, I think we might have shared with you. So the thesis of this podcast is, why do some companies scale better than others, right? And you've already touched on so many of them. I'd like to sort of come back specifically to professional services businesses because, you know, we're professional services that, as you shared with us, that has been your background and you built an exemplary business in professional services. One of the things that we're seeing in professional services now, as we dig more into, you know, working more and more with professional services companies, because we think there's a massive opportunity for professional services to scale more effectively now and going forward. That will be a lot easier than you had it at Salo or that we've had it up until now.
Nice. I want to know it. I want to know how to do it.
Yes.
Secret sauce.
We'll get there. But I think what's interesting is what we've seen just in the last month or so of chatting to a lot of people at professional services companies, primarily in the sort of AEC space or architecture, engineering, construction space. They so heavily index on the fact, and we get it because we know in a professional services company, relationships are everything, right? But what we've realized is that they've totally over-indexed on relationships to the point where they're frozen, as my kids would say, or our kids would say, in the 1900s, that they don't realize that there's so much more you can do now to grow a professional services business through relationships by using some tools and data that did not exist, 20 years ago. I mean, you just gave the example of the HR system that you brought in, and you knew as a leadership team it was going to be very disruptive, but you, at one point on one day in a particular meeting, you made the decision that going through that disruption was going to be less painful than not doing it, right? Whereas there are still a lot of professional services companies who, have this thing where like, well, we've always grown through relationships and we will continue to do that. And we believe that that's a very dangerous place to be if you're not using, the data and technology that's available to scale. And even just one example is whether you have 100 consultants or 500 or 1,000, doesn't really matter. But if they can spend their time working with the most valuable clients and strengthening relationships with the most valuable clients, the ones that are most likely to bring the next project or the next big project, and not waste a lot of their time on relationships with some prospects that aren't going to go anywhere. The resource of time in professional services is so valuable. There's got to be a lot of value you can create by somehow automating that. But it starts with a new culture shift. So I know there wasn't really a question in there yet, but with your experience, which was interesting, I think the timing, because AI really just took off after,
After. Mm-hmm.
and it would be interesting to know. I mean, so I'm not even sure if you were looking at that anymore or how you would look at that, but we just think there's a huge opportunity for professional services firms. And if you have any sort of advice or insight for leaders of those firms, and, again, in that sort of mid-market, 100 to 1,000 employees, what would you do if you were leading a company like that, knowing that they're stuck in this sort of relationship model?
I feel like the first relationship that you need to nurture is the one with your employees. And I think in professional services firms, those that hyper focus or overemphasize on clients over employee experience are the ones that kind of get stuck at a period of time. So I agree, relationships matter, but they first matter with those that are closest to you. And then they get to empower how that relationship is external. And so one, that is a basic premise. How do your employees, how are they feeling? What is that relationship? What do they mean? And then what is the relationship with the client that we want? What is our responsibility and role with that? And what is theirs? And again, it pulls right back to your values. And so one of our values at the time was aware and intuitive. Like, what is that EQ that we have? How are we sensing what's going on with our client? And how are we sort of jumping ahead and being like, when you said that, it felt like there was something else there, And I think, again, I'm going to go back to acknowledging that there is something there, being able to take it and then proactively bring that up. I think that's important. When I think about the use of AI tools, I think the more it can be used for rote things and think about it as highest best use of talent and kind of empowering each individual in the company to say, if you were at your highest best use, what would you get rid of? What would you do? How would you do it? And is that now possible through this? Which would be great. And I think getting back to the why of, I loved your example of, if I could spend my time with this people and do this much more versus if I'm down here with somebody that I know is never going to buy, how do I augment? So I think of AI and technology as augmentation. And again, the more people we can ask in our organization, what do you need? How would you be at your highest best use? They're bought into it. Then they're like, yes, give me more of that.
Yeah, really good. Thank you. So when Amy asked you about the question that sort of led to your answer of alignment and intention or intentionality, there was a third thing that you mentioned.
Focus.
I mean, it's very clear in all your answers so far that everything was done with intentionality and therefore led to focus. But is there anything else that you'd like to add specifically on how you think about focus?
Or did the focus lead to intentionality? Who knows? No, I'm
chicken
kidding.
Or the egg kind of situation?
No, I actually think intentionality does lead to focus. I mean, a well-defined strategic plan is critical. I don't know if you know that I'm involved with a startup again, and it's a professional services startup in a slightly different space than I was working in before. So I'm learning a ton. And they're really at a point where we think we can scale. And I'm like, well, if we are going to scale, here is the recipe. And we're going to start with defining our mission, our vision, and our values. And the founder came back right away and she's like, oh, I think I've got it. And like, she pounded it out. And I was like, you're probably not that far off. But what if we got the team to help us, really create and be part of that creation of our foundation? What would that mean? Mm-hmm. And so I'll tell you, it takes a lot of time. We did a SWOT analysis. We interviewed all of our customers. We sent a survey out to every employee. And then we brought in somebody else to kind of help us with some of that. But those foundational elements, I'm like, we can't scale until we know what we are promising people and we know what our employees, how they're going to act and be able to do it. So I firmly believe in that. And then the next thing after you do that is, what are the 3 things we're going to focus on? Now, it usually comes back to, as you started the podcast, people, process, and systems. But what does that mean for this organization at this point of time? And I said, when we're in the room, I'm like, this is where we debate what we're working on this year. This is where we debate it. Once we get out of here, then anytime somebody comes up with this crazy idea, including me, I'm like, oh my gosh, we should go to this thing. It's like, everybody should say, how does this come back and fit into what we agreed? Now, if we come back and say, we have a better idea now, we all have to then re-agree that that is what the case is. So I just think a strategic plan that is based in mission, vision, values, that then you have your team involved with, where are the 3 biggest areas that are going to help us achieve our vision, and then get just crystal clear on how we are going to accomplish that. That's how you create focus. Everybody gets a say, but then once we agree, then we go.
That's the way. Yeah. Well, I liked what you said. You were gathering some data. You conducted interviews, you said, and you distributed a survey. So you took that feedback, those data points, and that informed the decisions that you made. And a lot of people that we talk to either are not looking at their data, or on the flip side, have so much data that they don't even really know where to start and what to look at. So would you be able to speak to some data points that you guys used in your business to help you make those important decisions about a direction that you were going to take?
Yes. I will first talk about sort of synthesizing that data, because you get a ton of it. And I said,
Yes.
Okay, one of the hardest parts is taking all this, and what we're looking for are themes. So I always say we're looking for themes, but we're also looking for the outlier that's going to make a big difference. So yes, we want themes, but sometimes there's one little thing in there that one person says that you're like, oh, I hadn't thought of that before. And so that's hard to teach, sort of. Like the themes, a lot of times you can start to see, and you have collate, you kind of synthesize those. So we had multiple people, founder, the person running it, I'm chair of the board. We each kind of did our own synthesis to sort of see what we came up with. Well, my admin, who I've worked with for many years, she's amazing. She's like, what if I run this through AI? So she comes, so me, 30 years in business, I've had the successful company, I come with my ideas. She runs this through AI, and it's not that far off. And I was like, oh my gosh, I just spent hours doing this. She spent 10 minutes doing it, and we got to about the same place. Now, I do feel like I learned a lot by going through it myself. So one, just sort of that process and how you bring this next generation of information, how you do it faster, how it's augmenting me. I guess that's a real example that I've now used. I would say that. The second thing is, there were things that we heard both from our clients and from our employees. So it was like, I'm trying to give an example, sort of this, we kind of coined it as shoulder to shoulder. We're a professional services firm. So in some organizations, it's we come in, you get your information, we do all the work, and then we report back to you. That's not ours. Ours is really, in effect, become part of your team. And so it sort of came up like one of our clients is like, well, you kind of sit next to us. And then somebody else said, well, when we go in with a client, sort of we sit next to them. And so this, when it was coming both ways, this shoulder to shoulder really sort of resonated for us, and now has become a way to kind of create a picture of how we work with clients. Is that a good example?
Yes. Yeah. You're taking all the different responses from the various people that you asked for feedback, and you're saying the theme of what we're hearing is that we work shoulder to shoulder with our clients and maybe teams internally as well.
Yes. And so then that then becomes a value of how we live, right? And so
Yes.
if I'm working with a client and all of a sudden I'm telling them versus participating with them, that's very different.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Amy, so just sticking on the data thing for a little longer, one of the things that we also see is that different companies use different KPIs or metrics that the leadership or the leader of a different functional area uses to run the day-to-day, week-to-week, quarter-to-quarter, et cetera. So, for example, in professional services, a very common metric is revenue per employee, right? You're familiar with that one? Did you use that one too?
No.
Not really. No. Okay.
We didn't. We should have probably.
Well,
in certain respects we did, but it wasn't like a common KPI that we used, honestly.
right. Well, and I think one of the reasons that a lot of professional services firms use that metric is because it's one very simple metric. So if you're tracking it monthly, quarterly, annually, et cetera, it's very easy to tell if it's increasing or decreasing, first of all. And it can also tell you if your margins are improving or not, because if your revenue per employee is increasing, but your profitability is not increasing, then you have another problem somewhere else. But it's a really good first, indicator. So with what you're doing now, how are the metrics, being in a startup now, sort of 20 years after, or how are the metrics going to be different in the startup now versus what you were using at Salo?
Well, when we started at Salo, I'm pretty sure we didn't have any metrics. That's
Right.
how I would do it. And I was also, as you were talking, I was thinking about that revenue per employee. And when we started, we were in everybody was just sort of in it. It was just like, we're going to go. And so I would say our revenue per employee would have been outrageous, right? But we didn't have the infrastructure and systems and processes in place to sustain it long term.
To scale. Yeah, you couldn't scale. Yeah.
We couldn't scale, or we did, but we scaled at the sacrifice of having a few people do a lot of things, which made us very vulnerable. When you have a team of superstars with no infrastructure, process, or systems, you are a vulnerable company. We were making more. So if we would have only looked at that KPI at that time, it would have been like, awesome. Now we start to put infrastructure in. And as we put that infrastructure in, we're making less per employee. You could almost say, well, gosh, we're not better off now, but yet we were. And so I just think of like, what gets measured gets done. So be careful that you know what you're measuring and what you're watching. That's the only thing I would say. That would be the downside of that if I think about it in the early years.
Sure. Yeah. I guess I was thinking more about like when Salo was at like 100 plus people, and knowing that what you're doing now, I'm sure is going to be at least that as well. How would the metrics be when Salo was more mature? Are they consistent with what they would be now in a startup?
I think you just have to look at, I always feel especially, well, I think in any company, when you are investing, your metrics look terrible. Okay. They do, because you have to, as a business leader, as a business owner, you have to spend money before you start to get that back. And so I think just watching where, I don't know how I want to say this, but when you're investing in that, your metrics are going to look worse than when you're performing at a high level. And when your metrics start to look really, really good, I would argue, is that the time you should be investing for that next stage of growth so you're not stagnating. And that is a hard balance, because I think we've all known there's been things as leaders we've invested in that have never paid off.
Yeah.
And there are things that you invest in that pay off way more than you think they're going to be. And so that's how I use those metrics, are more from a, hey, where do we think this should be based on how we are investing and what we're putting money and time into? And then how do we know when to cut bait and like, this just didn't work, those are sunk costs, or when to reinvest again?
Yeah.
When we were making the most money, my partner and I were working like crazy, right? Everybody was way overworked. But then when we lost somebody, the ability to bounce back from that was just too much to be able to handle. And so, I think it's a delicate balance between people, process, systems. You can also have overemphasize process and systems and lose some of the people. So it's a delicate balance. And the only way to not do it, I think, I'm going to go back to our mission, vision, values. Where are we going? Is everybody on board with that? Why are we doing this? Do I align with the company? And how am I expected to behave?
Yeah. I think what I'm hearing, though, too, is this time around with your new venture, a little bit more predictability would be comforting. And a lot of companies that we talk to who are able to nail down these metrics, use their data and kind of forecast, like see into the future to a certain extent, are more comfortable making those investment decisions and that sort of thing, because there's a predictable nature to the growth. It's not just like, oh, well, that was a pleasant surprise.
Yeah, I think what I'm most comfortable with is being uncomfortable. I think that's what it's got me. I feel like wisdom is like, now something hits and I'm like, okay, team, this hit. We can get through this. Here's what we do. Versus I think the first time around when something hit, I was like, is this the end of us? What's going to happen? Like, how do we even get beyond this? We can't ever survive without the blah, 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 the next thing. And so I do think just knowing that whatever hits, we can get through. I think that's one. And I also feel like I'm more confident that when an investment doesn't work, that that's okay. We don't have to keep putting good money after bad. It's okay. You make mistakes. What did we learn from it? So it kind of got better at the bounce back, if that makes sense. And so knowing what to watch and like, this just isn't going to pay off. I'd say that for sure. Secondly, I've gotten a lot better about having different minds at the table. The more diversity that I've had around kind of a table, whether it's through a board, whether it's through the management team, when people have grown up in different ways and have had different diversities of thought, whether they've lived in other places, grew up in different ways. You know, when we started our company, we were all Big Four CPAs, everybody in the company. And that worked when we were a young company because we knew how you were trained. We knew how you thought. We knew how you were thought to be trained. And it was very, very predictable. But it became, we needed other people at the table who had experienced different things to be able to get us to grow further. And so I think diversity in every way, gender, race, backgrounds, where experiences,
age is a big one right now.
Age is huge right now. The teams, I've learned that over time, when that exists and how to engage that, I think has been a huge learning. And I think a lot of times, I mean, I was 29 years old when I left corporate America, started the company at 30 and I thought, I have to know all the answers. I feel now I'm like, I don't actually have to know any answer. I just have to make sure I know what questions to ask. And then how do we get enough people that know what they're doing around to answer it?
Love it.
Amy, thanks so much for being with us today.
You're welcome.
It was great meeting you.
Thanks for having me.
This was, a lot of value, and congratulations again. And we look forward to catching up again soon. Did you enjoy this episode?
Find more at RevOpsChampions.com.